A teacher vanished in 1985. 39 years later, her students would find her journal hidden in a school locker, a voice frozen in time that revealed the secrets she never lived to share. Back then, though, it began with something so ordinary no one thought twice about it. Margaret Holloway waved goodbye to her students, the kind of casual wave that seemed like nothing at all. The bell had just rung, lockers were slamming down the hall, and a chilly wind was blowing dead leaves across the parking lot. It was the fall of 1985, the kind of fall where the air smelled like bonfires and pencil shavings. That wave, that ordinary moment, was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. Her name was Margaret Holloway, though almost everyone called her Miss Holloway. She was only 32 years old, young enough to still have that bright energy that pulled students in, but old enough to be respected, to carry authority. She taught English at West Ridge High School, a small-town school surrounded by cornfields and two-lane highways that seemed to stretch forever. On that day, she left her classroom just like any other. Books under her arm, a scarf looped around her neck, her sensible brown leather shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. She pushed open the heavy glass door, the one that always screeched a little on its hinges, and stepped out into the cool October air. A few students saw her get into her pale blue Chevrolet Cavalier. She smiled, nodded, and then drove off. No one could have guessed that in just a few hours, her car would be found abandoned on the side of the road, and Margaret Holloway would vanish without a trace. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. West Ridge was one of those places that looked frozen in time. Brick storefronts with hand-painted signs. A diner where the waitresses called everyone honey. Kids rode their bikes through the neighborhood streets, and families went to church every Sunday without fail. In 1985, the town had just over 5,000 people, which meant everyone knew each other's business or thought they did. Margaret had moved to West Ridge only a few years earlier. She wasn't originally from there, and in a town that small, that made her something of an outsider. She grew up in Illinois, went to college for English literature, and came to West Ridge looking for a quiet place to teach and write. She never married, though she wore a thin silver band on her right hand that sparked endless speculation among students about whether she was secretly engaged. She lived alone in a modest little house on the edge of town, with her golden retriever, Penny. To her students, she was the kind of teacher who stood out. She made Shakespeare sound less like homework and more like gossip, acting out the lines in voices that made the kids laugh. She loved poetry and always smelled faintly of vanilla and chalk dust. But in the weeks before she disappeared, a few students noticed something different. She seemed distracted. Sometimes she'd trail off mid-sentence, staring at the door like she was waiting for someone to walk in. She often stayed late after school, long after the halls were empty. That Friday evening, October 18th, she was supposed to stop by her sister's house for dinner. Her sister, Helen, lived just 10 minutes away. Helen had made roast chicken, Margaret's favorite. But when 7 o'clock came and went with no sign of her, Helen started to worry. She called Margaret's house. No answer. She called the school, in case her sister had stayed late grading papers. No answer there either. By 9 o'clock, Helen drove over to Margaret's house. Penny, the retriever, was barking frantically inside, scratching at the front door. Through the window, the lights were still on. The table was set for one, with a plate of pasta waiting in the kitchen, steam long gone cold. It looked like Margaret had just stepped out for a moment and never came back. Helen called the police. At first, they didn't treat it like an emergency. 32 years old, single, no kids. Maybe she just needed a break, they said. Maybe she went to visit a friend. But Helen insisted this wasn't like her sister. Margaret was responsible to a fault. She wouldn't leave her dog, she wouldn't miss dinner, and she certainly wouldn't leave her car abandoned. Just after midnight, a deputy spotted the pale blue Chevrolet on County Road 11, less than 5 miles from the school. The car was parked neatly on the shoulder, as if Margaret had just pulled over for a minute. The keys were still in the ignition. Her brown leather satchel sat on the passenger seat, stuffed with graded papers and a red pen tucked neatly inside. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than she normally sat, a detail that would haunt investigators later. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Just an empty car, waiting on a dark country road. By morning, the story spread through West Ridge like wildfire. Parents whispered about it over breakfast. Students arrived at school to find her classroom door locked, her bulletin board of poems and essays frozen in time. The principal tried to keep things calm, telling everyone the police were looking into it, but the fear was already sinking in. Teachers don't just vanish. The first official search began that Saturday morning. Dozens of volunteers combed through the fields and woods around County Road 11. They walked in long lines, boots crunching on frosted grass, calling out her name. Dogs sniffed the ground, helicopters buzzed overhead, but there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no trace of where Margaret had gone. Her family clung to the hope that she might walk back through the door, smiling, embarrassed at all the fuss. But deep down, they knew. Something was terribly wrong. By Sunday night, her face was on the local news. A black and white photo of her smiling, wearing a floral blouse, stared out from the screen. "Missing teacher from West Ridge," the anchor announced, as if it were just another headline. But for the people who knew her, the nightmare was only beginning. If you ask the people of West Ridge today, they'll tell you that weekend felt like the world tilted off its axis. Nothing made sense anymore. Parents locked their doors. Teenagers whispered in the hallways about who might be responsible. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she had a secret lover. Some said she had gambling debts. Some whispered darker things, things that no one dared to say out loud. But back in 1985, all they knew for certain was this: Margaret Holloway had vanished, and whatever had happened to her, someone out there knew the truth. The chilling part? That truth would stay buried for nearly 40 years. Before the mystery, before the abandoned car and the endless search parties, Margaret Holloway was just Miss Holloway. To her students, she was the kind of teacher who made the school year feel less like a sentence and more like an adventure. West Ridge High in 1985 wasn't glamorous. The building was a blocky mass of brown brick, with narrow hallways that smelled of pencil shavings and disinfectant. The lockers were painted dull gray, always dented and scrawled with graffiti carved in ballpoint pens. The floors were polished to a shine each morning, but by the afternoon, they were streaked with muddy sneaker prints. In the fall, the old radiators hissed and clanged, filling the classrooms with uneven heat. But when students stepped into Margaret Holloway's English class, they often said it felt different. Her room smelled faintly of vanilla from the hand lotion she always carried. The walls were lined with quotes she hand-painted in looping script: "All the world's a stage. Not all who wander are lost." She let students pin up their favorite poems or doodles on a corkboard. Even if they were messy or crude, she had a way of making even the most reluctant kids feel like their voices mattered. Her teaching style was unusual for the time. Instead of droning through textbooks, she'd turn literature into theater. She made freshmen act out scenes from Romeo and Juliet, with plastic swords borrowed from the drama department. She assigned projects that pushed students to be creative, rewriting Canterbury Tales as modern gossip, or composing poems about their town. One boy remembered years later that he hated school, hated reading, hated writing until Miss Holloway pulled him aside and told him his poem about his grandfather was one of the most moving things she'd ever read. That boy went on to become a journalist. She had quirks, too. Margaret loved wearing scarves, even when it wasn't cold. She was always twirling a piece of chalk between her fingers while she talked. Her laugh, loud, unfiltered, carried down the hallway. She had a battered leather satchel that she carried everywhere, its straps worn soft. Students joked it looked like it had been through a war. Inside, she always kept a fountain pen, stacks of papers, and a small leather journal where she scribbled notes no one else ever saw. Outside of school, she was quieter. She rented a little house on Pine Hollow Road, a one-story with pale yellow siding and a sagging front porch. The neighbors said she spent evenings reading on the porch swing, her golden retriever Penny curled at her feet. She planted marigolds and snapdragons in the yard, though she could never keep them alive past the first frost. She loved music, Joni Mitchell, Fleetwood Mac, Simon and Garfunkel records that spun late into the night while her typewriter clacked away. Because, you see, Margaret wasn't just a teacher. She was a writer, or at least, she dreamed of being one. Friends said she was working on a novel, though no one ever saw a finished draft. She'd stay up late tapping at her typewriter, stacks of paper piled high, only to tear out pages the next morning and start again. Her sister Helen sometimes teased her about it, saying she'd never let anyone read her work because she was her own worst critic. But Margaret was determined. She wanted her words to matter. Her family described her as loyal, stubborn, with a streak of independence that sometimes worried them. She wasn't the type to settle down just because it was expected. She dated now and then a fellow teacher, a man from the neighboring town, but nothing serious ever seemed to stick. Margaret would laugh it off, saying she was married to her books. Yet in quieter moments, she admitted she hoped for something more. A husband, maybe. Children. A family. In Westridge, she stood out. Most of the teachers had lived there their whole lives, knew their students' parents, went to the same church every Sunday. Margaret, with her city upbringing and big ideas, felt like fresh air in a place that sometimes resisted change. Some parents adored her. Others whispered that she was too liberal, too different, too single. In a small town, being different was sometimes all it took to draw suspicion. Her students noticed a shift in her during the fall of '85. A few recalled that she seemed distracted in class, as if her mind was elsewhere. She'd glance at the door when footsteps passed by, or pause in the middle of grading papers, staring off into space. Once, a student caught her erasing something from her leather journal so furiously that her knuckles turned white. Another remembered finding her crying softly at her desk after school, though Margaret quickly brushed it off as just being tired. She also started staying late more often. The janitor, Frank Dawson, remembered seeing her car still in the lot after 10 o'clock some nights. He'd pass her classroom and hear the rhythmic tapping of her typewriter. Sometimes she'd wave to him with a smile. Other times, she looked startled, almost guilty, like she hadn't expected anyone to notice she was still there. Helen, her sister, thought maybe it was stress. Margaret had mentioned in passing that she was dealing with some unpleasantness at school, though she wouldn't go into detail. Helen pressed her, but Margaret brushed it off with a vague smile. Later, Helen would replay those conversations again and again, wishing she had pushed harder. And then there were the letters. In the weeks before she disappeared, Margaret received several envelopes in her mailbox with no return address. Her neighbor, Mrs. Langley, said she'd seen Margaret retrieve one and immediately crumple it up, her face pale. Another time, Margaret tucked a letter into her satchel quickly when she realized someone was watching. No one knows what those letters said. None of them were ever found. To her students, though, Margaret never let on that anything was wrong. She kept smiling, kept laughing, kept asking them to believe in their own voices. On the surface, she was still the teacher everyone loved. But underneath, something was stirring. Something that would soon spill out into the open, changing everything. The week she vanished, Margaret gave her juniors an unusual assignment. Write about a secret this town keeps. Some students laughed it off, scribbling silly answers about cafeteria food or local gossip. Others took it seriously, writing about things they'd overheard, adults whispering late at night. When the papers were collected, Margaret lingered over them longer than usual, her face unreadable. One student remembered later that she asked him, very quietly, "Do you think people here ever hide the truth because they're afraid of what might happen if it got out?" He shrugged. He was 16. He didn't know how to answer. Looking back, it seemed like Margaret was trying to tell someone something without saying it outright, like she was carrying a burden no one else could see. And just days later, she was gone. By the time Sunday rolled around, when her car had already been found and the searches were underway, students started piecing things together in hushed whispers. "She looked nervous last week. She told me to hang on to my essay. She said she had a bad feeling." But in the moment, none of them knew how important those little details would become. The image most people hold onto is that wave she gave, walking out of the school building with her scarf fluttering in the autumn wind, a wave that seemed so ordinary. But for the kids watching, it would become a memory burned into their minds forever. Because that wave wasn't just a goodbye for the day, it was the last goodbye. It began with a missed dinner. Margaret Holloway was supposed to be at her sister Helen's house on Friday evening, October 18, 1985. Helen had made roast chicken, the way her mother used to, with rosemary and lemon and a pan of potatoes crisping in the oven. Margaret never missed family dinners. She might show up late, papers still tucked under her arm, apologizing with that half smile of hers, but she always showed up. That night, she didn't. At first, Helen tried not to worry. Maybe Margaret had stayed late at the school again, grading essays or fiddling with her typewriter. Maybe she'd lost track of time. Helen poured herself a glass of wine, set the table, and kept glancing at the clock. 7 came and went. By 7:30, she picked up the phone and dialed Margaret's house. No answer. By 8, Helen's patience had given way to unease. She called the school office, though she knew no one would pick up that late on a Friday. She even called a fellow teacher, hoping maybe Margaret had stopped by their place. Nothing. By 9, the chicken was cold, the potatoes congealed, and Helen couldn't sit still any longer. She grabbed her keys, told her husband to watch the kids, and drove across town. Margaret's little yellow house sat on the quiet edge of Pine Hollow Road, under the shadow of tall maples that rattled with dry leaves in the October wind. When Helen pulled into the driveway, her headlights swept across the windows. The living room light was on, the curtains were drawn. Penny, the golden retriever, was pacing behind the glass door, barking wildly. Helen's stomach dropped. She climbed out of the car and knocked hard on the door. "Maggie, it's me. Open up." No answer. Just Penny's frantic barking and the click of claws on hardwood. Through the window, Helen could see the kitchen table. A single place was set: a plate, fork, glass of water. On the stove, a pot of pasta sat untouched, the steam long since vanished. It looked like Margaret had been about to sit down for dinner, and then, simply, left. Helen circled the house, tried the back door. Locked. She banged on the window again, harder this time. "Maggie." Still nothing. She returned to the car, her pulse thudding in her ears. By the time she called the sheriff's office, her voice was shaking. "My sister's missing. Something's wrong. She wouldn't just leave like this." The deputy on the line asked the usual questions. How old was she? Was she married? Did she have a history of depression? Did she ever talk about leaving? Helen answered each one firmly. 32. Single. No history of depression. No, she wouldn't leave her dog. She wouldn't leave her family. She wouldn't miss dinner. The deputy promised to send someone over. But in a small county on a Friday night, it wasn't exactly top priority. By midnight, when Helen was still pacing Margaret's porch, a patrol car finally rolled down Pine Hollow Road. Deputy Alan Reed stepped out, notebook in hand. He was young, barely 25, with a calm demeanor that struck Helen as too calm. He shone a flashlight through the windows, jotted down notes, and asked the same questions again. "Are you sure she didn't just go to a friend's? Maybe she wanted to clear her head?" Helen snapped. "She didn't just go to a friend's. Her car isn't here. Her dinner's sitting cold on the stove. Her dog is locked inside. Does that sound like someone who went for a walk?" Reed sighed, then radioed dispatch. A few minutes later, word came back. Margaret's car had been spotted. A second deputy, on routine patrol, had noticed a pale blue Chevrolet Cavalier parked neatly on the shoulder of County Road 11. The car wasn't damaged, the doors were locked, but it had been sitting there for hours, and no one had claimed it. Helen insisted they take her there immediately. County Road 11 cut through the cornfields just a few miles outside of town. By night, it was pitch black, the kind of dark where the only light came from the stars and the sweep of headlights. When the patrol car pulled up, Helen's heart sank. There it was, Margaret's car. The pale blue paint glowed dully in the beam of the flashlight. The car sat perfectly parallel to the road, as if parked by choice. The driver's window was rolled up. No dents, no scratches, no broken glass. When Deputy Reed unlocked the door, the smell of stale coffee and paper drifted out. Margaret's leather satchel lay on the passenger seat, bulging with essays, her fountain pen clipped neatly inside. The keys were still dangling from the ignition. Helen leaned into the car, her voice catching. "This isn't right. She would never leave her things like this." The deputies examined the car. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than Helen knew Margaret ever Saturday, a small detail, but unsettling. In the back seat, a sweater was crumpled, the one Helen had knitted for her last Christmas. Nothing looked stolen, nothing looked broken, and yet, everything felt wrong. It was as if Margaret had parked her car, stepped out into the night, and disappeared into thin air. The next morning, the search began. By dawn, volunteers gathered at the high school parking lot. Farmers in work boots, parents clutching thermoses of coffee, teenagers still wearing their Letterman jackets. They split into groups, fanning out along the cornfields and wooded edges of County Road 11. The air was sharp with frost. Breath clouded in the air. Dogs barked, straining at their leashes as handlers guided them into the tall grass. Helicopters whirred overhead, the sound rattling across the quiet fields. They called her name again and again. "Margaret, Maggie!" The cries echoed, swallowed by the silence. Helen walked with them, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign. A scarf, a shoe, a page of her journal. Anything. But the fields were empty. The woods gave nothing back. By midday, the only thing they had found was a broken beer bottle and a discarded candy wrapper. The sheriff's office set up a command post. Maps were tacked to the wall, red markers tracing the areas already covered. Deputies interviewed neighbors, friends, colleagues. Students were pulled aside and asked if their teacher had seemed upset, if she had mentioned going anywhere. But the answers were all the same. Margaret wasn't the type to just vanish. That Sunday night, as the town settled into an uneasy silence, the local news ran her photograph. Grainy, black and white, her smile a little stiff as she stood in front of the school building. The anchor's voice was flat, professional. A West Ridge teacher has gone missing. Police are asking anyone with information to come forward. But in West Ridge, no one needed the news to tell them. Everyone already knew. The town was buzzing with whispers, with fear, with theories. Parents warned their kids not to walk alone. Neighbors checked on each other twice before bed. Something terrible had happened to Miss Holloway. And if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. For Helen, there would be no sleep that night. She sat in Margaret's living room with Penny curled against her, staring at the cold plate of pasta on the stove. It sat there like a ghost of her sister's last normal moment. The truth was sinking in. Margaret hadn't just missed dinner. She hadn't just gone for a drive. Something or someone had taken her away. And from that night forward, life in West Ridge would never be the same. By Monday morning, West Ridge was no longer the same quiet little town it had been the week before. The school parking lot, usually filled with yellow buses and the sound of students spilling through the doors, was now lined with sheriff's cruisers, reporters' vans, and volunteer vehicles. Deputies came and went, clipboards in hand. Teachers huddled in whispers. Students lingered in clusters, their voices low, eyes darting toward the empty classroom at the end of the English wing. The door to room 214 Miss Holloway's classroom stayed locked. The poem still hung on the corkboard, the chalked notes still waited on the blackboard, half erased. Her mug with the words, "World's okayest teacher," sat abandoned on the desk, a ring of cold coffee at the bottom. Everything in that room looked as though she had stepped out for just a moment and would be right back. But everyone knew she wouldn't be. The town mobilized quickly. West Ridge had always been close-knit, the kind of place where a single siren sent neighbors stepping out onto their porches, asking who was in trouble. Now, the entire town seemed to move with one shared pulse: find Margaret. The sheriff's department organized daily searches. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of volunteers gathered in the high school gymnasium each morning, where maps were spread across the bleachers. Farmers, store clerks, mothers with babies strapped to their chests, teenagers eager to help, they all took part. They combed through the fields, dragging sticks through the brush. They walked the wooded trails, eyes sharp for any sign of torn fabric or dropped jewelry. Dogs sniffed tirelessly, tongues lolling, their barks echoing through the quiet fields. From the sky, helicopters circled, their thumping blades rattling across rooftops, drawing families outside to crane their necks at the sight. News cameras trailed behind, catching every grim expression, every moment of hope that flickered and died when searches turned up nothing. The sound of voices calling Margaret's name became a constant backdrop. "Margaret, Miss Holloway." The cries echoed across the cornfields, carried by the cold wind, unanswered. By Tuesday, the local diner was buzzing with tension. Over steaming mugs of coffee, people swapped theories. Some thought she had been kidnapped by a stranger passing through. Others insisted it had to be someone local, who else would know her schedule so well. A few, lowering their voices, muttered about the possibility of scandal. "She was always too friendly with those kids," one man at the counter whispered. "She wasn't that type," the waitress shot back sharply. "Don't you dare." In a small town, whispers travel fast. By the end of the week, rumors were blooming like weeds. Some claimed she had a secret lover and ran away. Others swore they had seen a suspicious car parked near the school at night. One woman even suggested Margaret had joined some kind of cult, though no one could name what cult exactly. The sheriff's department struggled to keep control. Sheriff Douglas himself, a heavy-set man with thinning hair, tried to project authority in nightly press conferences. He stood at a podium in front of the courthouse, microphones shoved in his face, saying the same thing over and over. "We are following all leads. We are not ruling anything out." But behind the scenes, deputies admitted they were stumped. There were no signs of a struggle at the car, no footprints in the mud, no fingerprints that didn't belong to her. It was as if she had vanished into the night without leaving so much as a shadow behind. Helen, meanwhile, refused to leave Margaret's house. She slept on the couch with Penny curled against her legs, waking at every creak and groan. Each morning, she walked through the rooms, searching for some clue. She had missed a note tucked in a book, a page in her sister's journal. But there was nothing. The house felt frozen, trapped in that last unfinished meal, the dog bowls half full, the typewriter still loaded with a half-typed page. She kept calling Margaret's phone, even though she knew no one would answer. The ring echoed in the empty house, cruel and hollow. Students at West Ridge tried to keep to routine, but the absence of Miss Holloway loomed over them. Her juniors entered room 214 once, escorted by the principal to collect their books. They said it felt like trespassing, stepping into her classroom without her there. Some of them cried quietly, others kept their faces blank, refusing to let emotion slip out in public. Teenagers grieve differently, but all of them carried the same unspoken thought. If their teacher could vanish, maybe no one was safe. One student, a 16-year-old named Sarah, would later tell reporters that she kept looking toward the door in English class for weeks after, half expecting Miss Holloway to come bursting in, apologizing for being late. It felt like she had just stepped outside and would be right back, she said, but she never was. By the end of that first week, the search effort began to shift from hope to dread. Volunteers trudged silently through the woods, no longer calling her name as loudly as before. Their boots crunched on dead leaves. The cold October wind bit at their cheeks. People started avoiding each other's eyes, afraid of what they might see reflected there. Still, they searched. Still, they hoped. But in private, whispers grew darker. She didn't just disappear, one man muttered at the gas station. Someone made her disappear. The fear seeped into everyday life. Parents stopped letting their kids walk to school. Women refused to jog alone. Even the bravest teenagers, who once roamed the town at night without a care, started keeping their curfews. Doors were locked earlier. Porch lights stayed on longer. West Ridge was a town that prided itself on safety. People left keys in their ignitions, front doors unlocked, bicycles in the yard. But after Margaret Holloway vanished, everything changed. Safety became an illusion, and everyone knew it. Helen clung to hope as best she could. She stood at every press conference, clutching a photo of Margaret in her floral blouse. She pleaded with anyone who might have seen something, anything, to come forward. And yet, days stretched into weeks, and still, nothing. It was as though Margaret had been swallowed whole by the town itself. That was when the wild theories started. The kind of whispers that keep people awake at night, wondering if they're true. One rumor said a car had been seen idling near County Road 11 around the time Margaret disappeared. Another said a man in a dark coat had been hanging around the school parking lot. Still, another swore she had been working on something dangerous, a story, maybe, and that she had stumbled onto the wrong secret. But no one could prove any of it. And so the town waited, holding its breath, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. Because West Ridge had become a place haunted not just by the absence of a teacher, but by the terrible knowledge that someone among them might know exactly what had happened to her. The first few weeks after Margaret Holloway vanished were a blur of activity, noise, and mounting frustration. Deputies fielded dozens of calls each day. Some were earnest, neighbors convinced they'd seen something out of place. Others were wild goose chases from people desperate to be involved. And then there were the strange ones calls that seemed more like riddles than tips. At first, investigators tried to follow every lead, but quickly, they found themselves lost in a maze of contradictions. One farmer swore he had seen Margaret's car driving past his field late Friday night, long after deputies had logged it abandoned on the shoulder of County Road 11. He was sure, he said, because of the distinctive pale blue paint and the way the headlights flickered. But when pressed, he admitted he had been drinking that night and couldn't say whether it had been 11 p.m. or 1 a.m. A teenager claimed he saw Miss Holloway at the gas station the next morning, wearing her scarf, buying a pack of gum. He described her down to the freckles on her face. The problem? By that time, the entire town already knew she was missing. His friends later admitted he liked attention and often made things up. Even more confusing were the reports from the school itself. Frank Dawson, the janitor, told deputies he had seen her in her classroom late on Thursday night, the day before she vanished. He was sweeping the halls when he noticed her typing furiously at her typewriter. When he waved to her through the window, she looked startled, as if she hadn't expected to be caught. But another teacher swore Margaret had left early that same evening, saying she wasn't feeling well. Both were adamant. Both couldn't be right. The sheriff's office tried to keep rumors under control, but it was like trying to hold water in their hands. Every day brought a new story. Some insisted Margaret had been having an affair, though no one could agree on with whom. Others muttered about gambling debts, ties to strangers passing through, or even involvement with drugs. Helen grew furious each time she heard one of those whispers. "My sister wasn't like that," she told reporters, her voice trembling with anger. "She was a teacher. She was kind. She was responsible. Stop making her into something she wasn't." But the rumors had a life of their own, spreading like wildfire through living rooms, church pews, and late-night diners. Then came the psychics. It started with a phone call to the sheriff's office. A woman from 2 towns over claimed she had visions of Margaret near water, a river, maybe, or a lake. She insisted deputies should drag the old quarry. Not long after, another psychic showed up in person, carrying a deck of tarot cards. She told Sheriff Douglas that Margaret was caught between 2 worlds and would be found near a place of learning and a place of death. No one knew what that meant. Yet another psychic wrote a letter saying she had seen Margaret standing in a field of tall grass, reaching out for help. The sheriff tried to brush them off, but some volunteers took them seriously. For days, searchers scoured creeks, ponds, even drainage ditches, hoping for a breakthrough. Each time, they came up empty-handed. The media made it worse. By the second week, news vans from outside the county had rolled into town, parking along Main Street and sticking cameras into the faces of anyone who would talk. Headlines screamed, "Beloved teacher, missing without a trace. Mystery in a small town. Did she run, or was she taken?" Reporters lingered in the diner, eavesdropping on conversations. They knocked on doors uninvited. They asked Margaret's students to describe their teacher's dark side. For a town that had always kept its business private, the intrusion felt unbearable. And yet, some people leaned into it. A few locals played up their stories, exaggerating encounters with Margaret or inventing ones altogether. One man claimed she had confided in him about a powerful enemy, though no one could remember them ever speaking before. Another said she had once mentioned feeling watched, but he couldn't recall when or where. For investigators, it was a nightmare. Every new lead contradicted the last. Every thread unraveled into nothing. Helen kept showing up at the sheriff's office, demanding answers. She brought coffee for the deputies, trying to keep them on her sister's case. But as the weeks turned into months, the urgency began to fade. Other crimes needed attention. Other calls needed answering. The trail, cold from the start, was now frozen. And still, the rumors grew. One particularly persistent theory claimed that Margaret had stumbled onto something dark at the school. A few students whispered that she had been looking into financial records, missing funds, perhaps, or that she had found evidence of misconduct by someone in authority. The story changed depending on who told it, but the core was always the same. She had uncovered a secret, and someone wanted her silenced. Another rumor was stranger still. A group of teenagers swore they had heard chanting coming from the woods near County Road 11 the week she disappeared. They spoke of candles, strange symbols, and shadows moving through the trees. The word cult was whispered in hushed tones. No evidence was ever found to support it, but in a town desperate for answers, even the wildest theories took root. By winter, the case was slipping into limbo. The flyers, once taped proudly to every storefront, had begun to yellow and curl at the edges. The search parties dwindled, volunteers returning to their lives. The sheriff stopped holding nightly press conferences. Reporters packed up their vans and left. But for Helen, the nightmare never ended. She still sat in Margaret's living room some nights, Penny's head resting in her lap, staring at the typewriter that still held a half-finished page. The words stopped mid-sentence, as if Margaret had been interrupted. Helen kept telling herself that one day her sister would walk through the door, laughing, apologizing for worrying everyone. But deep down, she knew something terrible had happened. And the truth was buried somewhere out there, hidden in plain sight. The strangest part? Decades later, when the journal was finally discovered, some of Margaret's own words seemed to echo those early rumors. Notes about being watched, fears of betrayal, warnings that she had found something they didn't want her to know. But in 1985, no one could make sense of it. All they had were whispers, and every single whisper led to a dead end. Winter came early that year. Snow drifted across County Road 11, covering the shoulder where Margaret Holloway's car had once been found. By Christmas, the only evidence left was a dark stain where the salt had eaten into the pavement and the faint memory of searchers tramping through frozen fields with flashlights. The case, already cold, froze harder with the ground. By January of 1986, the sheriff's department quietly scaled back its efforts. They had no body, no suspect, no solid evidence at all. The case file filled with tips that went nowhere, interviews that contradicted each other, and photographs of an empty car that revealed nothing new each time investigators looked at them. Sheriff Douglas stood before reporters one last time, his voice flat. "We are continuing to pursue all leads, but everyone in West Ridge knew the truth. The trail had gone cold." For Helen, life split into two halves, before Margaret disappeared and after. Before, her days had been ordinary cooking dinner for her husband, helping her kids with homework, visiting her sister for long talks over coffee. After, every day felt like a void she couldn't climb out of. She kept Margaret's house, visiting often to water the plants, to feed Penny, to dust the shelves. It felt wrong to let the place sit empty, like closing a book before the last page was written. Penny grew restless in those months, pacing the door, ears perking whenever a car slowed on Pine Hollow Road. Some nights, the dog would howl, long and mournful, until Helen came and sat with her on the porch. Neighbors said it gave them chills. As the years dragged on, Helen's life bent around the absence. She attended every anniversary vigil, held on to every flyer, sat with every detective who promised a new angle. She never moved away, never stopped asking questions. It cost her more than she admitted. Her marriage strained under the weight of grief. Her children grew up knowing their mother was always half elsewhere, her mind caught in 1985. The town, meanwhile, did what towns do. It moved on. West Ridge couldn't hold its breath forever. The diner went back to serving burgers and gossip. The high school filled with new students who had never even heard of Miss Holloway, except in whispers. Teachers came and went, lockers were repainted, the halls echoed with fresh laughter. Room 214 was eventually reassigned, her chalkboard scrubbed clean of the last lines she had written. By the 90s, only the older students remembered her vividly. They told stories to their younger siblings about the teacher who made Shakespeare fun, about the wave she gave that last afternoon. But as the years stretched, even those stories began to fade, like photographs left too long in the sundae. In town, the whispers never fully stopped, but they grew quieter, more like ghost stories told at sleepovers. Teenagers dared each other to walk down County Road 11 at night, saying, "Miss Holloway's spirit lingered there, waiting for someone to notice her." Others said her house was haunted, that you could hear the typewriter clicking late at night if you stood on the porch. For Helen, those rumors cut deep. She wanted her sister remembered, not turned into a ghost story, but she also knew that in West Ridge, memory worked that way. Tragedy became folklore. Every year on the anniversary, Helen organized a small vigil. At first, the gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, parents. Candles flickered in paper cups. Voices trembled as people shared stories. But as time passed, the crowd thinned. 5 years in, it was mostly family and a handful of loyal friends. By the 10th anniversary, it was a dozen people standing in the cold with their candles, whispering Margaret's name into the night. Still, Helen lit her candle every year. Still, she prayed for answers. For the sheriff's department, the Holloway case became a file in a cabinet, then a box in a storage room. New sheriffs came and went. Each one promised Helen they would take a fresh look. Each one grew quiet after a few months. Detectives reviewed the car photographs again, reread the same witness statements, knocked on the same doors. Nothing changed. By the 2000s, the case was officially considered inactive. Not closed, not solved, just waiting, always waiting. Her former students grew up and left West Ridge, but many carried Margaret with them. One boy who had once struggled with reading became a novelist, crediting her for sparking his love of words. A girl who had been shy and withdrawn said Miss Holloway was the first adult who ever told her she had potential. Every time those former students came back to town, they glanced at the school, remembering her scarf fluttering in the fall wind, that final wave. Some of them told their own children about her. Others stayed silent, unable to explain the ache of losing someone who had believed in them. The decades blurred. By 2015, the world had changed. Cell phones, the internet, DNA databases. Entire generations had been born since Margaret vanished. But for Helen, time stood still. She still kept Margaret's typewriter in her living room, still dusted it weekly. The last page was still in place. The words, frozen, mid-sentence. Sometimes I think the truth is, and then, nothing. Those words became an obsession for Helen. What truth? What had her sister been about to write? She asked herself that question every day for nearly 4 decades. And then, in the 39th year, everything shifted. The high school announced a reunion for the class of 1985. It was meant to be a cheerful event, old classmates reconnecting, laughing about bad haircuts and prom nights. But for many, it stirred up memories of Margaret. She had been such a presence in their final year, and her disappearance had cast a shadow over their youth. A group of those former students decided to explore the old, unused wing of the school during the reunion. That wing had been locked up for years, the paint peeling, the lockers rusted. They wandered the hallways, laughing, their voices echoing in the emptiness. And that was when they found it. A locker wedged in the far corner, its door stiff with rust. When one of them pried it open, dust billowed out, and inside was something they never expected to see. A battered leather journal, the cover cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Margaret's handwriting, her words. Hidden there all along. The silence of 39 years was about to break wide open. By the fall of 2024, West Ridge High School was a different place than it had been in 1985. The walls had been repainted, the lockers replaced, the chalkboards swapped out for whiteboards and flat screens. But to the class of '85, walking back into those halls felt like stepping into a time capsule. The reunion had been advertised for months. Flyers in the mail, emails from the alumni committee, Facebook posts brimming with photos of mullets, shoulder pads, and old yearbook pages. For some, the idea of returning to West Ridge was exciting. For others, it was bittersweet. The shadow of Margaret Holloway's disappearance still lingered for those who had sat in her classroom, who had watched her wave goodbye that final day. The night of the reunion, the school gymnasium was strung with twinkling lights, tables lined with punch bowls and trays of catered food. Old songs from the '80s played over the speakers, the same ones they had once danced to awkwardly at homecoming. Former classmates hugged, laughed, compared wrinkles and waistlines. The smell of floor polish and cafeteria food mingled in the air. For a while, the night was filled with laughter and nostalgia. But as the hours wore on, conversations turned, as they always did, to the one story no one could shake. "Do you remember the day she disappeared?" one woman asked, her voice hushed even now. "I still see her, walking out with that scarf," another replied. "She was the best teacher I ever had," a man said, shaking his head. "It still doesn't make sense." There was a pause, a silence that fell heavy even in the middle of the music and laughter. Because for all the time that had passed, Margaret was still there in the room with them, not in body, but in memory. Late in the evening, a small group drifted away from the gym, drawn by curiosity. Someone suggested a walk through the old wing of the school, the part that had been shut down years ago, after new construction had rendered it unnecessary. The halls there were colder, quieter. The paint peeled in long curls. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. Dust hung in the air, stirred by their footsteps. Their voices echoed strangely against the empty walls, louder than they meant them to be. "This feels haunted," one of them whispered, half joking, though their tone carried unease. They passed rows of lockers, their paint chipped, their doors slightly ajar. Some still bore stickers and scribbles from decades ago. A faint smell of mildew clung to the air, mixed with something metallic and stale, like time itself had seeped into the building. And then, in a corner where the hall bent toward a stairwell that had long since been sealed off, they found it. A locker, rusted shut, its number plate faded almost to nothing. Unlike the others, this one looked untouched, as if it hadn't been opened in years. One of the men, tall, still carrying the strength of a farmer's life, tugged at the handle. It groaned, resisted. With a grunt, he yanked harder, and with a screech that echoed down the hallway, the door gave way. Dust billowed out, thick and choking. They coughed, waved their hands through the air, and then peered inside. At first it looked empty, just shadows and cobwebs. But then someone spotted it, a battered, leather-bound journal wedged in the corner. Its cover was cracked, its edges curled. The group fell silent. One of them reached in, hesitated, then pulled it out. The leather felt fragile, as though it might crumble in their hands. On the first page, faded but unmistakable, was handwriting. Margaret Holloway's handwriting. They knew it instantly. Her students had seen it 100 times, in red ink on the margins of their essays, in looping script across the blackboard. Even after nearly 40 years, they recognized it. And in that moment, the reunion laughter died away, replaced by something else entirely: awe, fear, and the heavy realization that they had just stumbled onto a piece of their teacher's last days. The group huddled around the journal, their voices low, reverent. "Do you think this is really hers?" one whispered. "It has to be. But how did it end up here? Who put it in this locker?" The questions tumbled over each other, but no one had answers. Someone flipped carefully through the pages. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed, but the words were legible. At first, the entries were ordinary notes about lessons, reminders about grading papers, and fragments of poems. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The words grew darker, uneasy. "She keeps writing about being followed," one of them murmured. "She says she feels eyes on her, even in the classroom." Another pointed at a page where Margaret had scrawled, "Someone is watching me. I can't shake the feeling, even at home, even at school." A chill ran through the group. They carried the journal back to the gymnasium, their voices urgent, cutting through the music and chatter. The reunion, once lighthearted, shifted instantly. People crowded around, leaning in to see the fragile book. Gasps filled the air as word spread Margaret's journal had been found. Helen, now in her 60s, was there too. She had come to the reunion at the invitation of old classmates, though she had hesitated. But when she saw the journal, her knees nearly gave way. Tears welled in her eyes as she touched the worn leather, whispering, "Maggie." It felt like her sister's voice had reached across nearly 4 decades, speaking at last. The discovery made its way to the sheriff's department within hours. Deputies arrived, collected the journal carefully, placed it into evidence. The room buzzed with a mix of excitement and dread. For so many years, the case had been nothing but silence. And now, suddenly, there were words. Margaret's words. But the journal didn't just offer hope. It carried an edge of something darker. Because the more they read, the more they realized Margaret hadn't simply vanished into the night. She had known something. She had feared something. And whatever it was, it had been close enough to her life and to this town that she had hidden her journal away inside the school itself, as though she knew it might one day be the only way to tell her story. The reunion that had started as laughter and nostalgia ended in uneasy silence. People left the gymnasium glancing over their shoulders, unsettled. Because if Margaret had been right, if she had been followed, if she had uncovered something, then someone in West Ridge might still know the truth. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, the Holloway case wasn't just a cold mystery anymore. It was a live one. The leather journal was more fragile than anyone expected. Its spine cracked with each careful turn of the page, its edges flaked into dust when touched. The ink, though faded, carried Margaret Holloway's familiar looping script, the same hand that had once scribbled notes in red pen across her students' essays. At first, the entries were ordinary, the kind of notes any teacher might jot down at the end of a long day. September 5th, 1985. Lesson plans for Macbeth. Juniors seemed engaged, though the girls whispered too much in the back row. Remind myself to pick up chalk before Friday. September 9th. Penny needs new food. Helen is making roast next weekend. Do not forget the wine. The early pages were full of small reminders, classroom details, and fragments of poetry she loved. In the margins, she doodled flowers and snatches of lyrics. It was mundane, even comforting. But as the weeks went on, the tone shifted. Slowly, at first, then sharply. September 21st. Someone was at the school long after hours tonight. I heard footsteps in the hall while typing. Thought it was Frank, but when I checked, the hallway was empty. I don't know why I'm writing this down. Maybe I'm just tired. September 29th. Papers have gone missing from my desk. At first, I thought I misplaced them, but I'm certain they were taken. Draft chapters too. Why would anyone want them? Am I imagining this? October 3rd. Saw a car outside the house again. Same one as last week, parked down the street with its lights off. When I looked out the window, it drove away. Penny barked until I pulled her inside. The entries grew shorter, sharper, as though she was writing in a hurry. October 7th. I am being watched. I feel it everywhere at school, at the store, even walking Penny. I told Helen I was fine, but I lied. Something is wrong. Helen read those words at the sheriff's office with her hand pressed over her mouth. She remembered that fall vividly, how her sister had seemed distracted, how she had brushed off questions about being stressed. Now, decades later, she realized Margaret had been carrying fears she hadn't shared. The deputies, too, leaned in as they turned each page. October 10th. I found something. I should not have looked, but I couldn't stop myself. Records that don't add up. Missing money? Why keep them hidden in the storage office? I need to be careful. If anyone finds out I saw. The sentence trailed off, the pen mark running to the edge of the page. Beneath it, in hurried script, was another note. If something happens to me, someone must know. It was not an accident. Look in the books. Look at who signs them. The words sent a chill through the room. The journal didn't just describe paranoia. It described a discovery, something tangible Margaret believed she wasn't supposed to see. Something tied to records and missing money. The next entries were scattered, more frantic. October 12th. The letters came again. No return address. Stop digging. That's all it said this time. They know I saw something. They know. October 15th. I wanted to tell Helen, but how can I? If I say it out loud, it becomes real. I don't want to put her in danger. Maybe if I keep quiet, it will stop. Maybe I am already too late. October 16th. Heard the footsteps again. This time outside the classroom door. I opened it. No one there. I think they are waiting for me to slip up. I don't sleep anymore. I leave the lights on. Penny growls at shadows. The group of former students who had found the journal described the sensation of reading these words as if their teacher was sitting beside them, whispering across the decades. Every page deepened the unease. Every sentence seemed to tighten the noose of dread around her. The final entries, written just days before she vanished, were almost illegible. The pen strokes were jagged, the ink blotched where her hand must have trembled. October 17th. I am certain now. They are watching me at school. When I stayed late to grade papers, I saw the shadow move outside the glass. I don't think I am safe there anymore. But where else can I go? This town. It feels like a cage. And then the last entry. October 18th. Sometimes I think the truth is. The sentence stopped there. A line of ink dragged across the page as if the pen had been pulled away mid-stroke. No more words followed. The rest of the journal was blank. When deputies read that final page, the room fell silent. It wasn't just a diary anymore. It was a testimony, a warning, perhaps even a clue left deliberately for the future. Helen wept quietly, her hand clutching the fragile book as though it were her sister herself. The sheriff's department, after nearly 40 years of silence, suddenly had something new, a reason to reopen the case. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. What records had Margaret seen? What money had gone missing? Who had sent the letters? And why, of all places, had she hidden her journal in a locker in the unused wing of the school? Some believed she had hidden it because she feared her house might be searched. Others thought she had chosen the school because it was her second home, the place where she had spent most of her life. Whatever the reason, the journal had survived nearly 4 decades, waiting for someone to find it. And now that it had been found, the truth Margaret hinted at could no longer stay buried. For Helen, for the former students, for the entire town of West Ridge, the discovery of the journal changed everything. The story of Margaret Holloway was no longer a cold memory. It was alive again. And the clock had just restarted. The journal changed everything. For nearly 40 years, the Holloway case had been little more than a yellowed file in the sheriff's evidence room. Deputies came and went, sheriffs retired, and the case was passed along like an unsolvable riddle that no one truly believed could ever be answered. But now, the fragile leather book was sitting under glass in the evidence room, its pages whispering about missing money, letters of warning, and shadows in the night. Sheriff Carla Ruiz, the county's first female sheriff, had taken office just 2 years before the discovery. She was younger than the case itself, born in 1987, after Margaret had already vanished. She'd grown up hearing the story like a ghost tale whispered by older kids, but until now, she had never thought there would be a way to solve it. Holding the journal in her gloved hands, she made a decision. The Holloway case would be reopened. The first step was to re-examine everything with modern eyes. Evidence that had once been too limited could now be tested with 21st-century forensics. Margaret's car had long since been released to her family, but photos, seat fabric samples, and fingerprints were still preserved in sealed bags. Technicians ran the samples through updated systems. They dusted for partial prints using newer methods, compared old fingerprints against modern databases. For the first time, they had access to DNA analysis. A strand of hair found in the back seat of her car in 1985, once dismissed as untraceable, was now tested. The results came back weeks later. The hair didn't belong to Margaret. It was male, and it did not match any profiles in the national DNA system. A clue, but not an answer. Meanwhile, deputies began tracking down people who had been interviewed back in '85. Many had aged into their 60s and 70s. Some still lived in West Ridge. Others had moved away. Frank Dawson, the janitor who had claimed to see Margaret typing late at night, was now in a nursing home. When investigators visited, his memory flickered in and out, but one detail remained firm. "She looked scared," he whispered, staring past them at something only he could see. "Not like tired scared, like someone was in the room with her, someone I couldn't see." They pressed him for more, but that was all he gave. Other teachers recalled Margaret mentioning stress, though they hadn't realized how serious it was. One even remembered the assignment she had given her juniors that fall: write about a secret this town keeps. At the time, it had felt unusual. Now, it sounded almost prophetic. The most haunting discovery came when deputies followed the trail Margaret herself had left in her journal. Look in the books. Look at who signs them. They dug through archived records from the school district, pulling dusty boxes of financial ledgers from the 1980s. For weeks, they combed through pages of handwritten entries, searching for discrepancies. And then they found it. Multiple checks written from the school budget for repairs that had never been done. Money funneled to fake companies with no addresses, no employees. Signatures approving the expenses belonged to one man, Assistant Principal Gerald Whitaker. In 1985, Whitaker had been a respected figure. Stern, buttoned up, always wearing pressed suits and polished shoes. He had retired in the early 90s, moved to Florida, and died in 2002. At the time, no one had thought to connect him to Margaret's disappearance. But Margaret's journal painted a new picture. She had stumbled upon the discrepancies, and Whitaker had been the one signing off on them. If she had confronted him, or if he had realized she knew it could have been motive enough. The problem was, Whitaker was dead. If he had been involved, there would be no direct confession, no trial, just a shadow of guilt left behind in the records. But the more investigators dug, the darker it became. Whitaker had not acted alone. The signatures showed his approval, but the checks had been deposited into accounts that belonged to shell companies. Someone else had created those companies, someone with connections. And those connections led straight into the heart of West Ridge. The town's reaction to the journal was complicated. For older residents, it reopened wounds they had long tried to close. For younger ones, it felt like a story finally stepping out of the realm of myth. Old gossip flared up again. People who had once whispered about cults and affairs now whispered about Whitaker. Some swore they always suspected him. Others defended him, saying he had been a good man, incapable of violence. But Helen, sitting with the journal in her lap, felt no relief. If Gerald Whitaker was responsible, she said softly, then why hide her journal in a school locker? Why not leave it at my house? Why not go to the police? No one could answer her. Forensic analysts examined the journal itself. They found faint smudges of fingerprints that didn't match Margaret's, but the prints were too degraded, too incomplete to identify. More unsettling was this. In the very back of the journal, on the inside cover, there was a faint pencil sketch. A locker number. The same number where the journal had been found nearly 40 years later, which meant Margaret herself had hidden it there. The implications were chilling. She hadn't simply lost it. She hadn't simply left it behind. She had chosen to place it in that locker, as though she knew she might not survive, as though she was leaving behind a message in a bottle. The reopened investigation brought a wave of attention back to West Ridge. News vans once again parked outside the sheriff's office. Headlines blared. Teacher's journal found after 39 years. Cold case, reopened. Was corruption behind Margaret Holloway's disappearance? Former students were interviewed, their voices breaking as they remembered her laughter, her encouragement, her final wave. Helen, now with silver hair, stood before cameras holding up the journal, saying, "My sister tried to tell us something. We just didn't hear her in time." And yet, as much as the journal revealed, it also concealed. Margaret's final entry still haunted them all. "Sometimes I think the truth is." Truth is what? The answer seemed frozen just out of reach, trapped in that missing half-sentence. Sheriff Ruiz made a vow. They would not let the trail grow cold again. The journal had been Margaret's voice reaching across decades. And now, with new tools, new eyes, and a town still holding its breath, they would follow where it led. But as the case moved forward, darker secrets began to stir. Secrets that had been buried not just in ledgers and records, but in the lives of people who still walked the streets of West Ridge. Because Whitaker might have been dead, but what he had been part of, that was still alive. The truth, as it turned out, was not buried deep in the woods or hidden in the shadows of County Road 11. It was tucked into the neat rows of numbers, the looping signatures, the careful lies that had sat in plain sight for nearly 40 years. The journal had given investigators their first clear direction in decades: follow the money. And when they did, a story emerged that was both simpler and darker than the town had ever imagined. In the mid-1980s, West Ridge High School had received a surge of funding from the state. New construction, new textbooks, new programs, a windfall for a small-town district. But not all of that money went where it was supposed to. Assistant Principal Gerald Whitaker, it seemed, had been siphoning funds into fake companies with the help of at least one other accomplice. The records showed thousands of dollars funneled into accounts disguised as repairs and supplies. Margaret, meticulous and curious, had stumbled across the discrepancies while staying late to grade papers. She had been using a storage office for quiet typing sessions, and in the process, found records that didn't make sense. She hadn't planned to uncover anything. She had simply noticed, and that was enough. When she wrote in her journal about missing papers and strange letters, investigators now believed she had been threatened directly by Whitaker or someone working with him. The warnings "stop digging" were not paranoia. They were real. The hair found in her car? It wasn't Whitaker's, but deputies had a new lead. A name emerged from old employment records: a maintenance worker at West Ridge High who had left suddenly in the spring of 1986, just months after Margaret's disappearance. His name was David Lang, a man in his 20s at the time, hired part-time to help with construction. He had never been interviewed in 1985. His name wasn't in the case file. He had simply vanished from the records, moving states shortly after. Sheriff Ruiz's team tracked him down in Indiana, now an older man with thinning hair and a failing body. When deputies arrived at his door, he looked startled, almost relieved, as though he had been waiting for them all along. The interview lasted hours. At first, Lang denied everything. He barely remembered Margaret, he claimed. He had nothing to do with her disappearance. But when confronted with the journal, when shown the old records and the strand of hair, his resolve began to crumble. Finally, in a voice rough with age, he confessed. Not to murder, not directly, but to being there. According to Lang, Whitaker had approached him that fall with an offer of extra money. All he had to do was keep an eye on someone. He didn't ask questions, he followed orders. He watched Margaret after school, reported on when she stayed late, when she left, when she seemed nervous. He was the car parked on her street at night. He was the footsteps in the hall. The night of October 18th, Whitaker told him to intercept her as she drove home. Not to hurt her, he insisted, just to convince her to stop asking questions. Lang admitted he flagged her down near County Road 11, told her Whitaker wanted to talk. She pulled over, nervous, suspicious, but willing. He remembered her clutching her satchel tight against her side. Whitaker arrived minutes later. They argued. Margaret accused him of stealing, of betraying the school. She threatened to expose him. And that was when everything unraveled. Lang swore Whitaker never planned to kill her, but in the heat of the argument, Whitaker shoved her. She fell, hit her head against the car door. She didn't get back up. Panic set in. Lang claimed Whitaker checked for a pulse, cursed under his breath, then told Lang they had no choice. Together, they loaded Margaret into Whitaker's car. Lang never said exactly what happened next. He claimed Whitaker drove off with her, told him to keep his mouth shut. By the time Lang asked questions, Whitaker told him it was taken care of. Where she was taken, where she was left, Lang never knew. or at least, that was what he said. For investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a dead end. They finally had a confession that tied Whitaker directly to Margaret's disappearance, corroborating the journal and the records. They had evidence that she had not simply vanished, she had been silenced. But Whitaker was dead. He had taken the final truth to his grave. And Margaret's body was never found. When news of the confession broke, West Ridge reacted with shock and fury. Some said they had always suspected Whitaker, that his polished shoes and stiff smiles had hidden something rotten. Others swore they could never have imagined it. But the town as a whole felt the ground shift under their feet. The beloved teacher hadn't run away. She hadn't been the victim of some random drifter. She had been betrayed by someone in power, someone trusted, someone who had worked inside the very school where she had dedicated her life. It wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal of the entire community. For Helen, the news was both a relief and a devastation. Relief, because at last, she had answers. She had spent nearly 4 decades living in the shadow of silence. Now, she knew her sister had been telling the truth all along. She had been in danger. She had been right to be afraid. Devastation, because it was too late. Justice couldn't reach Whitaker. Margaret's body was still missing, and her last words, frozen mid-sentence in that journal, would never be finished. Helen stood at a press conference, clutching the journal against her chest. Her voice trembled as she said, "My sister tried to warn us. She left her words behind. She wanted us to know the truth. Now we do. And even if the man who did this can't face a courtroom, at least he cannot hide anymore." The town held a memorial that winter, nearly 40 years after Margaret had vanished. Former students flew in from across the country. They filled the gymnasium with flowers, photographs, poems written in her honor. People who hadn't cried in decades wept openly, as if finally allowed to let go. Margaret Holloway was given a plaque in the school's entrance, her picture framed beside it. For the students walking through the doors now, she became more than a ghost story. She became a lesson, a reminder. But one detail lingered, haunting even in the face of closure. When investigators examined the final page of the journal under ultraviolet light, they noticed faint indentations, the pressure of words Margaret had begun to write before the pen was torn from her hand. The sentence, unfinished in ink, stretched faintly across the paper in ghostly marks. "Sometimes I think the truth is closer than anyone will ever admit." And then, abruptly, nothing. Margaret Holloway's disappearance had finally been explained, but the hollow ache remained, a town forever changed, a family forever scarred, and a journal that whispered across decades, carrying her voice long after she was gone. Because in West Ridge, the truth had always been there. Closer than anyone wanted to believe.